I wanted to bring us back to order. Our final keynote for today is an exciting talk from Rasheedah Phillips. For those of you who probably been reading up on Afrofuturism, I think it's almost impossible that you didn't come across her name. So it's a real honor to have her here at the festival. She is a queer housing advocate, parent, writer, interdisciplinary artist, and cultural producer who uses web-based projects, zines, short films, archival practice, experimental nonfiction, speculative fiction, printmaking, performance, social practice, installation, and creative research to explore constructions of time, temporality, community futurism through a Black futurist cultural lens and experience. Phillips is probably also as highly known as a housing advocate, as director of the housing land use movement in partnership with grassroots partners, movement leaders, industry, and government leaders. Phillips has served as a managing attorney for the housing policy at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, has led various housing policy campaigns resulting in significant legislative changes, including a right of counsel for tenants in Philadelphia and the Renters Access Act, one of the strongest laws in the nation to address blanket bans of eviction policies having a disparate impact on renters of color. Her work has appeared in numerous magazines like Flux Architecture, Flash Art Magazine, Philadelphia Inquirer. She's a founder, of course, of Afrofuturist Affair and co-founder of Black Quantum Futurism and co-creator of the award-winning Community Futures Lab. And she's the creator of the Time Zone Protocols, Black Women's Temporal Portal, and the Black Time Belt Project. As a thinker and practitioner of Afrofuturism, she's really, for many, many years, been a sort of leading light, thinking about what Afrofuturism can mean in terms of transformation for action, policy, and practice. So it's a great honor to have her here at the Zora Hurston Festival to share her work. So, Rasheedah Phillips.
Okay, all right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here for all the reasons. I've been wanting to, even though we're not in Eatonville and I haven't had a chance to get there, I hope to get there. I'm just incredibly honored. So I'm going to read a talk that I wrote out. Because it's so dense, I'm gonna do a lot of reading. But behind me, you have some visuals. I'll describe a little bit what the visuals are. A lot of it is stuff that I've made over the years, but a lot of it is also interspersed with some AI art that I've recently been playing around with. I'm sure y'all know about that, what's happening with that. But the AI is based on my own work. So that's what we'll be playing in the background. I may pause in between and play some sounds too, just to give myself a little bit of break from talking. But yeah, I'm gonna talk. My talk is called Time and Place Have Had Their Say, the Time Binder's Role in Black Space-Time Mattering. So I'm not gonna read the whole description of the talk, but I'll just give you a brief preview of what you'll be hearing over the next hour or so. So Hurston as Griot had the powerful ability to wander through time and spirit as deftly as she could space, enabling her to bind time, an essential act of Black space-time mattering. This presentation will consider Hurston in her role as time binder and her work to matter Black space, time, and spirit, making legible the ways in which Black communities subvert, re-envision, reclaim, redesign, and dismantle the material realities of the mechanical clock and historical timeline, activating Black communal space timescapes that are alive, dynamic, textured, and where past and future dimensions of time and the no time of the spirit can be held in superposition. Hurston was a remarkable figure, not only for her contributions to ethnography, and you can start playing the video back there, please. Thank you. Not only for her contributions to ethnography, anthropology, and literature. Of course, she used anthropology and research to bridge the gap between past and present to connect with history in profound and meaningful ways. She was able to create characters in her stories that conveyed the complexities of African-American life while highlighting the spirit of resilience and humor. Through these characters, Hurston was able to respond to issues that were pertinent in her time, such as Great Migration, segregation, racism, while exploring universal themes. Hurston's anthropological fieldwork provided her with a deep understanding of the people she studied and their culture, allowing her to tell stories that were both historically accurate and deeply insightful. Through her vivid descriptions and use of dialect, she was able to capture a time and place and make it come alive for her readers. By using her storytelling to connect the past with the present, she was able to bridge the gap between different cultures and eras, and her research unearthed the customs, myths, and superstitions that informed the lives of the people she talked to. Less discussed, though, are the ways that Hurston's work grapples with the material realities of the mechanical clock, which orders our perceptions of linear, chronological, and a historical timeline that orients us in certain ways to past events. She tapped into the possibilities for creating new emancipatory stories about Black life through space timescapes that are alive and dynamic rather than static or linear. Alfred Korzybski's time binding theory is a concept that he developed in his book Science and Sanity, an introduction to non-Aristotelian systems and general semantics. The theory states that human beings have the ability to time bind, or accumulate knowledge and information over time and pass it down to future generations. This ability allows for the advancement of civilization and the accumulation of knowledge and technology. Korzybski believed that this ability to time bind is unique to humans and sets them apart from other animals. The process of time binding happens through the use of symbols such as language, writing, and other forms of communication. These symbols allow humans to record and transmit information from one generation to the next. And according to him, this time binding process is one that happens through the use of abstracting, which means extracting the essential characters of a given subject or object. And this abstraction process is used to create those symbols that represent the subject or object. And these symbols can then be communicated and stored for later use. Furthermore, the ability to time bind is also dependent on the human ability to reflect on past experiences and to make predictions about the future. Hurston's journey and her status as a time binder began at a very young age. In her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, she vividly maps out an experience that she has with the clutching hand of time as a thief at a young age. She was given knowledge before its time that left her with this known sense of her own fate and robbed her, as she describes, of her childhood innocence. In her book, she describes a vision that she has where a series of events that will come to pass in the future unfolded in her mind's eye, including the death of her mother in a few years. The visions from this involuntary act of divination would later come to pass with grim linearity, but it sees the conditions by which Hurston transforms into a time binder. As she watched her mother pass away, she pinpoints that this is the hour where her wanderings, not so much in geography, but in time began, and then not so much in time as in spirit. Although Zora's temporal rupture allowed access to the future, I also believe through disrupting the temporal prison of the here and now, she was allowed access to both the past and the future with the same privileges as the present. Even her number of years on this earth was elusive and subject to her own temporal manipulation. She was in some accounts born 10 years before the date commonly referenced for her. What does it mean for a Black time binder to bind time specifically? Time reckoning, like weather and like politics, has always been a local practice. And Hurston's childhood in the all-Black town of Eatonville gave her very early and significant insights into the ways in which Black communities create their own time and space based on their own experiences and perspectives. She notes in the opening lines of the autobiography that because time and place have had their say in the making of her, you will have to know something about the time and place where I came from in order that you may interpret the incidents and directions of my life. Her family and communal relationships that she describes in detail make Eatonville's Black communal time legible, as well as the ways that it diverged from the dominant narratives of Western civilization. Even how the settlers describe their timeline, migrating to the town just before or just after the stars fell, challenge our dominant conceptions of marking time. She gives countless other examples of Eatonville's unique temporality, and that's even deeper within her own family's temporality. She recognized that the mechanical clock, which is based on linear time, and a historical timeline, which is based on the idea of progress, are not the only ways to measure and understand time. Traditional European spatial temporal consciousness, around and prior to the 14th century, saw time as flow and inevitability. Early recordings of an abstract sense of time as continuous duration arose during the 14th century, while the word time itself derives from the word tide or tidis. Tidis has etymological roots in a Sanskrit word for division, to cut up, or to flood, as in the time of high water. Within the European Judeo-Christian religious order, work and prayer times were heavily regulated by law, and because of a belief in the biblical apocalyptic visions of the end being near, time had to be tightly regulated. In Time Wars, Jeremy Rifkin notes that Western culture institutionalized its images of the future by way of religion and politics, making sure that the future was something that could be made predictable and controlled. It is through religion and politics that a linear temporal orientation first came to be discerned, simultaneous to the development of Western culture and technology. A linear Western time consciousness stresses fixed events along a forward-moving timeline, while events themselves are seen as irreversible. The linear timeline is embedded within cyclical time. Note, hours, minutes, and seconds in their abstract and numerical form do repeat, but events themselves, however, are unique occurrences that will never repeat on a progressive linear timescale. This structure of time eventually came to be organized discretely and causally into a past, present, and future, with fixed events set against a forward-moving timeline, one that would eventually come to a climatic and chaotic end. The increased building and usage of public clocks and eventually personal watches and timepieces further inscribed a mechanical order of time that impacted all ways of the Western way of life, all aspects of the Western way of life. Sarah Bouval notes in Time Maps that only in the last couple of millennia did our uncompromisingly linear view of the past, symbolically captured in the modern relegation of time travel to science fiction, actually come into being. Again, this progressive future that's unidirectional does not allow access to the past and was further forged through other significant events in science and technology. The law of thermodynamics specifically, developed most significantly during the late 18th and 19th century, reinforced linear notions of time speeding into the future toward a chaotic end. And as Barbara Adam notes, energy was conserved but cannot be reversed. Other significant temporal historical events, such as the building of the first long-distance railroads, the inventions of the telegram, allowed the future to be conquered through a compression of space-time and allow for people to conceive of the future in terms of conquest. Further, the growth of global capitalism and maintenance of global colonization by European nations in their colonized territories increasingly required clock and calendar time standardization. The International Prime Meridian Conference, for example, is a critical point on the Western timeline for understanding the backward and forward-reaching impacts of time standardization and its resulting temporal oppression. The collapsing of capitalist time to natural times into natural times in ways that fundamentally shifted humans' experience of and relationship to time. And embodied within that time, that day, and that month is a white supremacist political, spatial, and temporal imaginary. The inscription of linear space-time was even discerned in the boundaries of slave ownership. 36 degrees and 30 north is the parallel of latitude that divides where slavery was allowed and prohibited in America under the Missouri Compromise, the line that separates the United States from the Confederate States. In Mastered by the Clock, Mark M. Smith describes the process by which white Southern slave masters adapted to a mechanical clock time and corresponding linear time construct as the dominant temporal consciousness over that of natural-based timekeeping methods. He notes in detail how this transition impacted the social order and reinforced values of discipline, economic gain, efficiency, and modernity. And simultaneously, Black people were forbidden access to the future in much the same way they were denied access to full humanity, both in vision and practice during slavery. In his essay, Time and Revolution in African America, Walter Johnson notes that one of the many things slaveholders thought they owned was their slaves' time. Indeed, to outline the temporal claim that slaveholders made upon their slaves is to draw a multidimensional portrait of slavery itself. Slaveholders defined the shape of the day, end quote. He goes on to note how slave masters controlled enslaved Africans' biographical time, where they recorded their slaves' birthdays in account books that only they could see. They determined at what age their slaves would be started into the field or set to trade, when their slaves would be cajoled into reproduction, and otherwise infused their slaves' lives with their own time through the daily process of slave discipline. Masters further encoded a temporal order by use of sound. Bells, horns, public clocks, chants, songs, speech patterns, all of that were used to regulate slave labor on the plantation. Temporal literacy and ownership of timepieces was also, for the most part, forbidden for enslaved Africans, lest it be used as a tool by which they gained their freedom. Timepieces came to be seen as a symbol of status and progress, as well as symbolic of the conquering of space and time, like the train and the telegram. For survival purposes, enslaved Africans did come to internalize some form of a linear time construct. Modern-day mechanical clock time and its ancillary linear temporal rhythms were encoded into the enslaved Black African by means of the whip and other forms of torture and physical violence. But enslaved people both obeyed and resisted clock time as if it were an extension of the slave master himself. Both Smith and Johnson detail ways in which time could be turned back upon its master by utilizing such passive strategies as working slowly, delaying conceptions, shamming sickness, or slipping off, as well as explicit acts such as mutinies, revolts, escapes, poisonings, magic practices, and other spiritual and religious practices. One potent example of the retention of the indigenous African spatial temporal orientation during slavery is the use of the North Star to point north on the Underground Railroad. Other examples included naming children after their day of birth or after ancestors. The so-called emancipation of enslaved Africans from bondage did not automatically free them of the master's clock. At the point of emancipation, the Western linear construct of space and time was already encoded into every aspect of the American way of life, social order, economy, transportation, and communication. Time continued to be used as another form of social control against oppressed communities. Through systemic racism and legal means, colored people's time was made material. Racial time was also used to catalyze and perpetuate systemic oppression, denying Black communities access and agency over the temporal domains of the past, present, and future, particularly through legacies of de facto and legalized racialized segregation and discrimination in public places, access to housing and land as well. In order to materialize these tropes of white proscribed Black time and maintain stereotypes that would reinscribe Blackness as inherently inferior, Black people were relegated to the status of clocks by way of racist material cultures of Americana memorabilia, where Black caricatures were locked into clocks, such as mammy clocks or clocks built into cast iron bodies, such as Topsy blinking eye clocks. As Black people sought more control over their own time and labor, these tropes would later morph into Negro time, Negro clocks, and an evolution of the phrase colored people's time, co-associating Black people and Black time with lateness and laziness. Many years ago, I came across some early print references to colored people's time in an 1878 op-ed on political divisions between the North and South. Another reference to CP time was slightly more positive in 1867. For some reason, I didn't add that quote, sorry. They said the colored people lose time, it said, attending public meetings. Well, what if they do? It's their own time. References to the old time N-word, the N-word's clock, and the old time darky surfaced in newspaper articles. And when I said N-word, obviously hard R, but I'm not gonna say that here. Surfaced in newspaper articles and literature soon after emancipation, a lament of the loss of the mythological, joyful, docile Black slave who is the happiest of all living creatures. Wonderful timing. Okay. If the archive is based on historical record, and Black people and bodies have always been relegated to the period of prehistory or pre-timeline, such that we are ahistoricized as an entire people and locked out of history, what then does history mean to us? What does history look like for us when the reigning concept of history developed and defined specifically by the white imagination. In a 2001 essay called Go There to Know There, Zora Neale Hurston and a Chronotope of the Folk, the author writes about how even Black people around Zora Neale Hurston's time challenged this understanding of folk time. And she writes, critical writing from the early 1930s suggests that Northern African American anxiety concerning folk culture was impeding efforts to theorize a politically active national racial community. Sterling Brown complained, for example, that African American intellectuals avoided folk topics, and Locke called for representations that would enable readers to understand rural Southern African Americans as commensurable within a modern temporality. Concerns about folk culture were fueled by the many sociological reports on Southern sharecropping released in the 1930s. And so this author writes, Charles S. Johnson, for example, argued that the Black Belt constituted a peasant society and described folk accommodation to both their economic status and to local white supremacist practices as fixed and complete. By imbuing her work with the temporal markings of the communities and rigorously upholding and representing them as they were, and not as she envisioned they should be, in intentional contrast to her other contemporaries, Zora upsets the tradition of anthropology and even Black literature and the notions of Black people as uncivilized or out of time. In general, when we're talking about indigenous African space-time cultural traditions, right, before slavery, this time consciousness has been described as having a backwards linearity, in that when events occur, they immediately move backwards towards what John and Beatty described as Zamani or macro time. In many indigenous African cultures and spiritual traditions, time can be created. It's independent of events. It's not real unless experienced, and is often intimately connected to genealogy, astrology, and ecological cycles. In his article, Time and Culture Among the Bamana, Mandinka, and Dogon of Mali, Kassim Kone provides examples of the ways in which the historical past and genealogies are conceptualized within context of space, place, totemic affiliation, and family names, for example, as opposed to exact chronology, recorded history, dominant figures, royal succession, centralized states, and internal relations like the West. From this time perspective, time is composed of events, days, while days, months, and years are just a graphic or numerical representation of those events. The indigenous heritage of time often made no sharp distinction between the past, present, and future, or yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and generally was uninterested in the minutiae of time, according to Amari Kokole. In his worksheet, A Comparison of the Western and African Concepts of Time, Bert Haminga notes we have to compare the Western linear dead physical timeline with past, future, and a regularly moving now with the African living time. Kone also points out that from a Western point of view, African time can be said to be one that is socialized, in contrast to a Western regimentation of time, which favors the alienation of other people's space, place, and time by private individuals. Events are situated in time as well as in context. Indigenous African notions of time in many traditions were also connected to natural events such as rainfall, rising and setting of the sun, or saw time as a natural rhythm or pacing, such as the time it takes you to walk from one place to another. Kone points out the example of the Como farming ritual of the Bamana people, which makes offering sacrifices to religious deities through various farming activities, with its primary significance lying in its role in a social construction of time, rather than as a ritual that sets in motion the farming season as seen by the West. Future events are situated in a potential time space until experienced or actualized. Those events do not depend on some specific clock time or calendar date for their manifestation. Instead, time depends on the quality of the event and the person or people experiencing it. Once the future event is experienced, it instantaneously moves backwards into the present and past dimensions. And those two dimensions bear the most ontological significance, where, according to Dr. Mbiti, a person experiences time partly in his own individual life and partly through the society which goes back many generations before his own birth. African and Afro-diasporan temporalities and traditions of time also share many parallels with quantum principles, in that the past intermingles with the present, is interwoven with the futures, and again, time in these traditions is alive, dynamic, and textured. Past and future variables can be held in superposition, existing in their infinite states of possibility, open to influence, collapsed into reality, and uncollapsed back into superposition at will. The roles and practices of the Afro-Indigenous griot provide an example of the use of temporal technologies that allow various dimensions of time to be alive, open to influence, and entangled. Composer and researcher Daniel Santos Diabate says that griots are considered historians, but not in the same way as an Occidental academic treats history. An academic seeks proven facts inside archives and books. The griot has a more dynamic role, not reduced to the telling of past stories, but as both transmitter of the past and witness and transformer of the present, focusing more on values and relationships than on proven facts and dates. Genealogy alone gives credibility to the story, and the griot's perception of time responds more to the hourglass effect, where the beginning and end, or birth and death, are the focus and not the middle. By his stories, he creates a contemporary reading of the past, a mixing of old and new values. If one takes the notion of history and literature into a more general category of interpretations of the past, then the griot emerges as a time binder, linking past to present. Microhistory, genealogy as proof, values and social structures, and a time binding function are the four traits of griots as historians, end quote. Griots are considered time binders in a sense, right, that they play an important role in preserving and passing down history, culture, and traditions of their community over time. As oral tradition keepers, griots use their storytelling abilities to transmit these things from their community and then from one generation to the next. They act as a living memory of their community, preserving those stories and events of the past. The role of the griot may also include cultural traditions of their community through storytelling, music, and song. And they play a vital role in these societies, again, acting as the keepers of history, culture, and tradition. Zora, in her role as griot, not only binds different dimensions of time together to construct Black memory, but to provide us early descriptions of Black temporality. Hurston was also committed to mattering and making legible the ways in which Black communities reclaimed, redesigned, and dismantled the material realities of the mechanical clock and historical timeline. In other words, she sought to make the ways in which Black communities experience time and space visible. One of the most striking examples of this was in her essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression, in which she wrote about how Black communities had their own unique way of expressing time and space, where time was not just an abstract concept, but a living force, a thing to be taken into account and to be reckoned with. A quote from that essay: "It is the lack of symmetry which makes Negro dancing so difficult for white dancers to learn. The abrupt and unexpected changes, the frequent change of key and time are evidences of this quality in music. Note the St. Louis Blues. The dancing of the justly famous Bojangles and Snake Hips are excellent examples. The presence of rhythm and lack of symmetry are paradoxical, but there they are. Both are present to a marked degree. There is always rhythm, but it is the rhythm of segments. Each unit has a rhythm of its own, but when the whole is assembled, it is lacking in symmetry, but easily workable to a Negro who is accustomed to the break in going from one part to another so that he adjusts himself to the new tempo," end quote. In Mules and Men, Hurston explores the ways in which Black folklore also is not just a collection of stories and songs, but a way of understanding and engaging with the world that is deeply connected to the spirit and temporality of the community. I'm gonna have, can you play one of those songs for me, please? Oh, honey, By being able to reposition her temporal lens so deftly, Zora Neale Hurston meaningfully disrupts progressive linear notions of time and actively radically creates visions of non-local futures, quantum nows, and unpredictable paths for marginalized Black people who are typically denied access to creative control over their own temporal modes and timescapes. As a time binder, Hurston dives into the past like an Olympic swimmer and brings back to the surface the stories and experiences of Black people that have been erased or marginalized by the dominant timeline. I developed the concept of the Black grandmother paradox to create and analyze Afro-diasporan temporal landscapes in Black speculative literature and Black women and femme-created films, playing on the grandfather paradox trope that's frequently used in time travel science fiction. I've described the paradox as having elements of the bootstrapping and predestination paradox for all you time travel nerds out there, but with nonlinear quantum outcomes and where cause and effect is opened up to multiple nonlinear influences. The paradox also acknowledges the ways in which time feels layered in Afro-diasporan traditions, where again, the past is always layered over the present moments. Our ancestors reside within us, even if on a different temporal plane or scale. The Black grandmother paradox considers the ways in which personal, familial, and communal spacetimes are entangled. Much like Dana and Octavia Butler's Kindred, the experiences of our great plus grandparents are fused into our bodies and providing a highway of sorts upon which we can travel backwards into their times, their memories, their experiences. It is what we know to be true, no matter how long and far we are scattered away from our homeland, that our generational ancestors reside within us. The paradox doesn't rip apart the space-time fabric of the universe as its original counterpart, and temporal queerness is tolerated. In fact, temporal queerness is welcomed or expected. The Black grandmother paradox entertains non-binary temporalities. Paradox is the tension that holds together space-time and not the threat or destruction or dissolution of space-time. The Black grandmother paradox and Black womanist temporalities emphasize a matrilineal or matricurvature timeline that are feminine and communally generated, in which personal, familial, and communal spacetimes are enmeshed. These communally generated nonlinear temporalities allow the futures to emerge into the past by way of dreams, omens, prophecies, and symbols, as it did for Zora that one day when she was young. The past remains a space of open possibility, of speculation, of active revision by multiple generations of people who are situated in the relative future, especially matrilineal descendants. The island of Willow Springs in Gloria Naylor's novel Mama Day, for example, is a communally generated nonlinear Black womanist temporality. The outside world's attempts to gentrify both the physical and temporal landscapes of Willow Grove is met with fierce and radical resistance from the residents and from the island itself. With the Black grandmother paradox and Black womanist temporalities, nonlinear cycles have no conceivable end, retaining the ability to shift directions and spiral along new paths where information can be added or revised. I've previously written and lectured about Dana in the grim fantasy of Kindred as continuously put in a position to birth and ensure her own timeline by choosing to save instead of kill her grandfather, undermining that classical trope of the grandfather paradox, if not defeating it altogether. The narrative eschews the traditional time machine that white men have been fascinated with since H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine, and a few decades after they could no longer legally use enslaved Africans as machines. Butler opts instead to present Dana's body's own genetic highway as the road on which Dana travels backward into time. In the essay Familiar Explorations, Temporality in Women's Writing, Irma Garcia notes that women's time is purely affective time, disrupting pre-established schemas and structures, and how in feminine time in general, notions of the past, present, and future are interdependent and blend into each other. Again, Dana provides a great example in Octavia Butler's having to ensure her own family's timeline. Michelle M. Wright also highlights how Butler and Black womanist writers such as Alice Walker create these bold new models for self-defined or internally defined notions of traditions, one, Black and female. Tradition, as understood there, emphasizes an overlapping past and present temporal dimensions, and in relationship of those two dimensions to each other, involves a future trajectory. Zora Neale Hurston directly engages with the concept of woman's time and temporality in her works. Their eyes were watching God. In Their Eyes Were Watching God, Hurston tells the story of Janie Crawford, a Black woman living in Florida who experiences different stages in her life and relationships. Through her journey, Hurston explores the ways in which Black women have created their own space and time, where again, the past and the future dimensions of time and in no time are held in superposition. In Their Eyes Were Watching God, the passage of time is a central theme as Janie ages and her perspectives on life and love change. The novel also explores the idea of how time shapes and changes a person and how different people experience time differently. From the mundanity of a first kiss, right, where she describes she was stretched on her back beneath the pear tree, soaking into the alto chant of the visiting bees, right, just bringing in all these nature things that are happening at the same time simultaneously, and comparing it to that experience, to sort of the larger reflections on life, right? To reflecting on her whole life, where Janie was able to transcend the mechanical clock and historical timeline and experience time as an ever-changing and ever-present entity. Hurston in the book wrote, for example, she pulled in her horizon like a great fishnet, pulled it from around the waist of the world and draped it over her shoulder. So much of life in its meshes. In this passage, Hurston was attempting to illustrate the idea perhaps that Janie was able to make sense of her world by connecting the past, present, and the future in a way that defined the conventions of the mechanical clock. Another example of this in women's temporalities is in her short story called Sweat. Zora Neale Hurston's Sweat is about a woman named Delia Jones who works as a laundress to support her abusive husband, Sykes. Delia is a hardworking and independent woman who takes pride in her work and is respected by her community, while Sykes, on the other hand, is portrayed as lazy, abusive, and unfaithful. He's resentful of her independence and constantly belittles her. And the story follows her struggle with Sykes and the challenges she faces as a Black woman living in the South during the early 20th century. The story primarily explores themes of domestic abuse, gender roles, and the resilience of Black women in the face of adversity. But more prominently, I think it incorporates themes of time and temporality. One way is through the depiction of Delia's daily routine of hard labor and the monotony of her life, which opens the story. But then the story also explores the cyclical nature of abuse, with Sykes regularly mistreating Delia and her having to endure his abuse until things happen. I'm not going to tell what happens in the story. And then additionally, the story sort of touches on the idea of time as a means of escape. And wishing to leave your present situation, wishing to start anew, right? But also just grapples with space and time in really interesting ways. And then it touches on the ways in which the abuse being inflicted by her husband is affecting her present. A scholar named Patricia McCloskey Engel writes that her husband, Sykes, wants her to be, in quotes, desperately enslaved to greed, fear, and hate, unable to claim or even imagine her own time, create potential, destiny, or personhood. Retaining her selfhood, McCloskey states, means generating an experience of time that is unbounded and free of the mechanistic causality induced by spatialized time. The story itself explores various modes of time throughout: communal time, work and labor time, mechanical clock time, seasonal time, personal time. And Zora Neale Hurston also writes this at a time when the interiority of women, Black women in particular, is thought to be non-existent or lacking value. In the story, Zora is giving Black women's time, domestic time, and interior time, and time to daydream, right? Her protagonist gets time to daydream. And that's given value. It's given privilege and prominence in the story. Communal time is also explored in the story in interesting ways as well. Community members, elder men in the story, describe how the abuse has aged her visibly. And because of all the harms Sykes has caused in the community, these community members also wish to see harm come to him. The story, again, not giving away the ending, right? But there's a sense of communal justice that aligns with what I've read, at least, about Congo Bantu notions of justice. There's a shared communal temporality toward an intention and an action in the face of abuse and communal disorder that's being caused by Sykes, that ends in sort of his comeuppance at the end. Space-time mattering, as proposed by Karen Berard, is a theory that emphasizes the interconnectedness and mutual constitution of space, time, and matter. Barad argues that space and time are not simply the background against which matter exists, but are active participants in shaping the material world. In other words, space, time, and matter are not separate entities, but are intimately connected and mutually constitutive. One of the key components of space-time mattering is the concept of interaction, which refers to the idea that entities do not pre-exist and then interact, but rather that they come into being through their interactions. This means that the properties and identities of entities are not fixed, but are constantly being shaped and reshaped through their interactions with other entities. Barad's theory also emphasizes the importance of considering the role of material practices and relationships in shaping the world. This means that scientific and technological practices are not neutral, but are instead shaped by social, cultural, and historical factors. Barad's ideas also challenge traditional notions of scientific realism, highlighting the ways in which power relations shape scientific knowledge and understanding. Their theory emphasizes the importance of considering the social and cultural context in which scientific knowledge is produced and the role of the observer in shaping scientific results. Barad's concepts like agental realism and interaction have been used to challenge the traditional understandings of scientific realism, and again, the role of the observer in scientific practice. Building on Barad's work, I propose Black space-time mattering to refer to the ways in which Black communities and individuals have created and experienced time and space in ways that diverge from those dominant narratives of Western civilization and scientific realism. It is a concept that emphasizes the importance of understanding those ways in which Black people actively shape our own experiences of time and space, especially within our communities, rather than simply being passive recipients of dominant cultural narratives. This concept is also rooted in the idea that time and space are not neutral, but deeply connected to our context. Therefore, Black space-time mattering is a way to understand how Black people have been impacted also by historical events, and again, how we create temporal resistance and spatial realities in the face of those events. Here, like the griot, the observer's role in Black space-time mattering is recognized as constitutive of matter. Space-time collapse is when a wave or a particle, initially in a superposition of all its theoretically possible states, appears to reduce to a single state after interaction with an observer, or measured gives a result corresponding to only one of the possible configurations. For Black people, we are measured or observed under the white gaze, collapsing our space-times into the Western linear timeline and limiting our possible configurations. Unobserved, unmeasured, and left to act out on our own infinite possibilities, we may exist in all states. Zora could make meaning of that collapse. She understood that as an observer, her presence changes everything and that subjectivity is not possible. Not only was she not objective, she was intimately entangled with the matter that she was observing. Leanne Duck notes here, in quotes, through representing her participation in the lives of the folk, Hurston shows the intersection of multiple temporalities in her own experience. In viewing the narrator, we see the temporality of the folk mapped onto that of the highway, the simultaneous cross space-time in which Hurston speeds from New York to Eatonville. In addition, we see the unclocked time of the lying session, which ends only when one participant has mumbled down into his shirt bosom and gone to sleep. The ambivalently marked time of the shack rouser who gets paid to see that workers do not miss a minute of labor and yet announces, instead of the time of the clock, that of the breaking day. The hoe cake and the rooster, the clearly transregional clock time of the laborer, half hour behind schedule, and the exaggerated lying time of 40 o'clock. Most notable, perhaps, is Hurston's juxtaposition of clock time with the transcendent timelessness of hoodoo, when she lies naked, face down on the snakeskin, waiting 69 hours, while her spirit went wherever spirits must go, that seek answers never given to men as men, end quote. Leanne goes on to say, back in quotes, though the unclocked time of the lying session and the transcendent time of hoodoo may not be common in northern urban experiences of modernity, they cannot be incompatible with such modernity, because Hurston is able to negotiate all these temporal forms in her experience. The significance of this representation of intersubjective time can perhaps best be demonstrated through comparison with the work of Richard Wright, who often represents folk consciousness as unable to accommodate the forms of understanding needed to communicate with the modern, end quote. Hurston's work also exhibits a quality that I call retrocurrence, an event whose influence or effect is not discrete and time-bound. It extends in all possible directions and encompasses all possible time modes. Again, her experiences as a youth being opened up to the clutching hand of time, as she says, gave her intimate knowledge of how memory waves spread across time and space, reaching backward in time and forward in time simultaneously to include everything that has happened, could have happened, will happen, and all the permutations therein. This dynamic event process takes on features and characteristics reminiscent of quantum matter, as I described earlier, where time is reversible and where information can flow in both directions. Her work helps me to understand and make the case for spatial, temporal, and linguistic reparations, the reclaiming of African-American folk tales and language and time reckoning, the way our language shapes our reality and the way our reality is shaped by time, or how we create, use, save, manipulate, squander, destroy, or even revel in no time. While we know Western linear time is an outmoded, ill-paced, oppressive, and clunky technology that may eventually be supplanted by quantum realities, it's impractical to expect immediate or equitable recompense with Afro-diasporic ancestral time consciousness and practices for Afro-descendant peoples. It is, however, practical to continue to develop, share, and fortify temporal practices and ethics that are consistent with our experiences. I also believe that feedback from the futures must guide the development of quantum nows and plural paths towards a deepening of colored people's time and towards a reclamation of healthier communal temporalities. Hurston was a true master of her craft, an innovative force in African-American literature, adept at weaving and everything she did, not just literature, and adept at weaving and excavating to tell complex stories, emotions, and rituals. As I've described, she was also a time binder, able to traverse, figuratively perhaps, but I also think literally, through time and space to both re-envision and mythologize the material experiences of Blackness in the public imagination. At its core, Hurston's work as a time binder was rooted in her ability to make sense of the past, the present, and future, while also holding the no time in superposition. A prophetess of her own life and a product of a Black communal temporal embrace, her remarkable ability to make sense of distant memories and recognize how Black communities experience time and space differently from the conventions of dominant culture allowed her to create a powerful bridge between them. With this bridge, she was able to reach beyond conventional understanding and perceive the no time of the spirit and the eternal motion of existence. She could more than others see that the clock and calendar, for what they were, the merest finger marking of the face of eternity. And for Black people, we must consider the incredible examples she set for us on how to activate Black temporalities in our own work, in our communities, in our lives. She has left us an incredible legacy on disrupting Western linear time. Those of us who have been denied access to the past and who are denied access to the future and to the histories of the future. She asked us to dare to question historical record, to dare to create our own, to dare to hack the white supremacist linear timeline, to dare to be expansive in terms of what the Black archive collects and where it lives and who stewards it. She dares us to reinvestigate, to uncover, to create, to recreate, to reconstruct infinite hidden histories, to hack into future histories where we have already been erased, ensuring our appearance and our continued existence, even when that period or that event has passed and receded into the so-called inaccessible past. She teaches us about the paradox of agency and the interweaving of communal temporalities, and that they all make for an elusive space-time, a fugitive space-time that can be described and mapped, but never truly captured. One must be there in the moment to truly understand it. Thank you so much.
you. Wonderful. I just wanted, I would love to hear you speak a bit more about fugitive slave time. I'm sorry, I said slave time. No, fugitive, you just ended up talking about fugitive space time. And I would like for you, if you could talk a little bit more about it. And it's interesting to consider that Kindred has now become a series. And so if you could connect it to even talking about that, especially as you were having your talking about the grandmother paradox and all that. So could you talk a little bit more about fugitive space time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll direct you to an essay where I talk about it in more detail, and particularly referencing the Juneteenth holiday, and just that gap in time to when Black folks, right, were awarded allowed to participate in emancipation, right? And thinking about just this notion that Black folks, right, we've always been fugitive in this construction of Western space-time. I also talk about in that same essay, this idea of wading in the water, right? Like when enslaved Africans were escaping and going along the Underground Railroad, right, stopping to wade in the water, and thinking about that as a way of hacking space-time, right? You're being hidden in the water, but this whole idea of the water and the river, wherever they're stopping, right, and how it carries time and how time moves in that water. For me, that's an instance of hacking this European time stream of waiting it out, right? Having patience, slowness, right? Being able to hide in that water. So that's what I'm referring to. I can go much more in depth, and as I said, I can share some of my previous essays where I'm talking about that in more depth. But in terms of Kindred, I was very disappointed in that series. As folks, it just really changed the story, and it just undermines, I think, in some ways, what Octavia Butler was putting forward in terms of us thinking about time, thinking about freedom. Just even the introduction of characters and the way that time is situated within that series, right? It doesn't give space, or it doesn't give time to really building up why she makes the choices that she makes, why she makes the decisions that she makes. Even the notion of her husband not being her husband in the series, and just like whether or not he would have did all these things with her, so for me, it just undermines the relationship and undermines a lot of the story itself. So I don't know if that I'm answering your question, but just that was my opinion on the series. Yeah.
We do have an online question. Someone asked, where can I get the books or illustration from this discussion, and can this be reviewed again?
I can share. I think it's being recorded, so it will be able to be viewed again in the future. I don't know that my speech is in a position to be shared quite yet. I need to clean it up a little bit because some of it was just me riffing versus what was written on the page, but I would be happy to consider sharing it with folks if folks want to see it.
A lot of the time discussion that you have intersects very strongly with questions of labor. And I'm really interested in the ways that the temporality that you're talking about in a sort of domestic communal space might be expanded upon. Can you talk a little bit more about that idea of like a kind of communal time that I feel like is in opposition to that kind of labor time, and I think it's referencing some ways that community and Black, as you talk about Zora Hurston talking about Black people have a particular notion of time, and what is the root of that time? Is it simply oppositional, or is it tied more directly to a kind of a generational narrative that we can trace back? Because I think one of the things that we always want to do in the Afrofuturist context is to see how these communal practices represent a kind of, like sometimes referred to as a kind of organic information network that persists over time, ironically, but is somewhat elusive, right? And so whenever I hear your work, I always think that you're very much tapped into that, like it's me thinking it, that may not necessarily be you, but I wonder if you sort of think about it in that context. There's a kind of domestic time element that has this very direct way that we can link to Africa, to the past, and how much of that is a kind of deliberate practice that people can understand that they're doing from generation to generation, and how much is it us, that is scholars in contemporary contexts, imposing a kind of orderly vision on these practices, right? Us sorting it out. And I know that's super, super nebulous, but I always wanted to ask you that. So now here you are, so I can ask you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's both, if I can say that. I think it's both. I think there is an intentionality in some ways, right? And I think people have an awareness. I just speaking for my own self, right, of like the fact that I have to navigate working a 9 to 5 because I have to labor in order to have money, in order to take care of my family, right? But also the awareness, right, that is not, I can shift into that and I can shift out of it. And so trying to stay aware of that. So I think Black folks are very aware of that. Especially so part of what I didn't share in this speech, but just thinking about coming out of slavery, like that Black folks were aware that their time had been stripped and stolen and taken away. They actually, many people sued their masters, right, their former slave masters, to try to match that and get that money, right? Understanding that time is money in this culture, right? To try to recoup that. So I think there is that awareness, but also, like I said, there's organicness. There's an organic way in which we relate to things like music, right? Like what the quote I shared by Zora about our rhythms when we dance, right? Like that's a natural thing of that just connects us back to, you know, those practices and rituals and ontologies and ways of being. So I think it's both. I think folks are intentional, right? And in our communities, working with folks, you know, in my role as a housing attorney and housing advocate, right? Being able to understand the ways that communities work to create time, but then how that time is stripped from them by things like gentrification or being displaced from their communities. I had the opportunity, you mentioned the Community Futures Lab, where I opened up a year-long oral futures project in the middle of North Philly in a neighborhood that was undergoing gentrification at that time. And just what I was able to talk about with people, right? Like these things came up naturally about how they create time together, how, you know, they have annually this year, this thing where they sit outside in the park and all come together and they bring tables and pick, right? So that's an expression of communal time, something that was threatened to be stripped away by this gentrification and everyone being displaced, but them being intentional about, like, even if no matter where we are in the city, after you displace us, we're still going to come back every year to the same place on the same day and have the same celebration in this neighborhood. So things like that, you know, and, you know, again, like in my work also as an attorney, right, I have to navigate court systems, right? And how court systems, which inevitably, right, Black people are most prominently featured within court systems and most impacted by things like eviction and things like the child welfare system and other ways that, and criminal, right, that within those court systems is time. Like those court systems are all about time. When I'm going to represent someone in court, it's all about how I can manipulate time in that space to get them more time in their homes, or to get them more time to move, or to get them more time to get money out, right? So Black folks are navigating both that reality, right, as well as the reality within their communities and their homes. And I think they are aware, right? Like if you were to ask folks that, and that was part of what I was able to do through that Oral Futures project, right? Like not just talking to folks in the midst of crisis, but creating a space where they can come in on their own time and have these conversations that they want to have. And just the things that people talked about, like people always ask me, like, how do you explain what Afrofuturism is to people? I don't have to explain it. Like you get in conversation with people, like they understand what Afrofuturism means. They understand how time is structured and how time oppresses, right? Like you just have to have those conversations with folks. And when I had those conversations, just the things that people shared about, again, how they spent time, traditions that they had in their family, traditions from that neighborhood, the memories that they held in that neighborhood, and how that cut against the dominant narrative being placed in the media about why this community was being displaced and gentrified. You hear it, you look in the media, it's okay, this is in the middle of North Philly, everybody's a violent criminal, basically, right? On drugs, like this is all you're hearing when you look at the media, and that is also used as a justification for taking these folks' homes. So like you have the government being like, oh, we're gonna come in and wipe this community out because they're not doing good, they've failed themselves, right? But excluding that annual thing that they do every year, or that this is a community that has an amazing jazz history, an amazing art history, an amazing history of Black liberation resistance, and just all these things that get left out of that narrative, that these community folks are able to maintain that memory. But if you're scattering them to the four winds, we're never going to know or hear these stories from that community. So I know that was a very winded way of answering the question.
That was good. Thank you. Your Afrofuturist up there, and that's one of the features, lab. I mean, all the work you're doing, I kind of understand your life. How does all this work? How's your time?
It doesn't always work. Let me just say that now, it doesn't always work. You know, I just was saying, like, I still have to work. I'm still miserable at my nonprofit. No, I love my job. Let me just say that. But, you know, I still have to work. I'd rather be writing science fiction stories. I still have to do all these things. So it doesn't always work, but I do maintain, you know, I do try to practice what I preach in terms of really activating and utilizing the tools that I have developed to share with others for myself. And it starts with, like, again, understanding that the 9 to 5 or what's on the clock is not the true time. And just really honoring my own time and temporality and space. But yeah, I don't know how to do it. Still trying to figure it out. But yeah, I can share a little bit more about some of the projects that we have. So the Community Futurist Lab, as I talked about, so that was a project that started in North Philadelphia, which is where I'm from. I live in Los Angeles now, but we opened up this space. It was a Afrofuturist community space where we privileged the narratives of the community against what was happening in terms of everyone being displaced from this community and the community being gentrified. Essentially what was there was public housing and maybe 500 people lived in public housing in that area. And then under the goals of redeveloping the community, they basically displaced all 500 of those people and then rebuilt $500,000 townhomes back in their place and then tried to bring people back anyway. But just having this space where folks could come in and again talk about what was happening to them, not have it just be drowned out by what the media was saying and what everyone else was saying. And so from that, we didn't just gather what we call oral futures with people, but we also used it as an opportunity to politically activate people and to get involved in some of the housing stuff that was going on. So what you talked about earlier and when you were reading my bio, some of the laws that we were able to get passed, like right to counsel for tenants who were facing eviction, some of that came out of that space as well, and working with folks through that space. So that's the Community Futures Lab. It was only open for a year, but it continues in other iterations. So we've been able to open a Community Futures Lab in Chicago. We're going to be doing one in St. Louis later this year, and all sorts of other spaces as well. So that's Community Futures Lab. Another project that we have is time zone protocols. So that was a few years of research that I did on time zones, basically, and on the International Prime Meridian Conference, which I mentioned during my speech, which was a place which was the beginnings of the globalization of time and setting the standard of time to Greenwich, England as the standard of time by which we all coordinate our clocks too. So I did a long-term study of that and just the effects of time of these sort of time zone protocols that emerged from this conference on Black people in particular, and looking at the sort of social historical context of that time. And then the last project I'll name, there's many more, but I've been very privileged to be a artist resident with CERN. So CERN, if folks haven't heard, is the biggest particle physics lab in the world. It's based in Switzerland. And so I had an opportunity to do a 3-month residency there, off and on, because I do work full time somehow. Got to interview over 30 quantum physicists, basically about time. And so my project was called, there's this thing in physics called CPT, symmetry and violations, and CPT stands for charge, parity, and time. And it's basically a fundamental symmetry of the universe, that these things, you know, if you send a particle forward or backward in time, it's symmetrical, right? Time is symmetrical in that way. I'm not going to go into exactly what it is, but looking at that and then sort of paralleling it to color people's time, since it's the same acronym, and just looking at different scales of time, looking at how quantum physics and science treats time, and just comparing that. So I have some projects that came from that, including a sort of timeline and some other things that I can share with folks, or you can go to our website, blackquantumfuturism.com, and it has all those projects up there. So that's just a preview. There's plenty more. Any other questions? Yeah. Looks like we have time for one more. Just monitoring the time.
It's just a simple question. I was just curious what the language or symbol system that you were using throughout these different images.
Adinkra symbols, which you talked about earlier. Some of them, yeah. The things that look like numbers and words? I don't know which ones you're referring to. It may have been something I created or. Okay. But yeah, for the most part, Adinkra symbols. One of the projects that I didn't talk about that I have also is called the Black Time Belt, which is looking at Black freedmen's towns and freedom colonies around the country, but sort of thinking about them as temporally connected through time rather than spatially connected. And so I used a lot of Adinkra symbols for that project as well to connect to these concepts of time. So yeah, that's yeah, I don't know what the other symbols are though. Could have just been something I made up randomly. All right, well, thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Well, I need this. Oh, there we go. That brings us to the end of our programming for this year's Zora Festival 2023, Spirit and Afrofuturism. Obviously, as we think about next and final year, we are turning or transitioning to the question of space. Obviously, space and Afrofuturism is a very important topic. It is one of the most compelling elements of a kind of visual language, outer space, space and the intersection of sort of African symbolism. Those are obvious things, but actually space is a place, is an album from Sun Ra that is often used to describe Afrofuturism. And the sort of centrality of space in Afrofuturist dialogue has much to do with the fact that it is, of course, a kind of an alienation that describes the African-American experience in very real ways, but also perhaps the idea that there are spaces that can be defined beyond the constraints of our Western sort of colonial experience. Those spaces offer opportunity for African Americans and for people of African diasporic descent to do more, be more, imagine more. And obviously, space also becomes a place where the manifestations of freedom and transformation associated with Afrofuturism might be made real. So the next year, we'll be dealing with space in very real ways. Obviously, Eatonville and its future as a space that is controlled by African Americans is much in debate. And perhaps the ideas that have been generated in these spaces, African spaces, spaces of African American history and culture, are also very important in terms of Central Florida and its experiences. So moving forward, next year, space will be our theme, and perhaps this will be the place where we offer up solutions and possibilities for what the next 100 years, 135 years might mean for African Americans and the long history in Central Florida. So look forward to seeing you here next year. And of course, again, thank you to UCF for their support, the Association to Preserve Eatonville community, and all the participants at the Zora Neale Hurston Festival. Obviously, we'll all be heading down to Eatonville at some point this weekend to partake in this sort of traditional festival. We always appreciate the fact that people are willing to come out and be a part of these academic conversations that are so important to the overall goal of the Association to Preserve Eatonville community. So I know that this is always been an important part of the festival, and I wish I congratulate Scott French and the folks at UCF History and Chatter for their continued support. And I thank all the keynote speakers, Scott, Rasheedah Phillips, for being able to deliver on, again, an exploration of Afrofuturism that I think has been meaningful for our audience and meaningful for all the people who will be able to engage with this after the program, because we'll of course document this and put it and make it part of our ongoing archive of this cycle. So thank you very much. And that's it.
I had an assignment. I had an assignment.
There you go.
Yeah. Yes. Good afternoon. I had an assignment. I was supposed to give closing remarks, so I have hightailed it back here to give closing remarks because this gives me an opportunity again to acknowledge the work that's being done and to say thank you. It also gives me an opportunity to say something to you that is in the spirit of Zora Neale Hurston and the person who rediscovered her for the popular culture, and that's Alice Walker. And Alice Walker said that Zora Neale Hurston's life is a cautionary tale. And that is because a woman of that genius was always scrounging for money. You know what scrounging is? Just scraping, always looking for money. And so that meant that that was a price that she paid. For us as an organization, it's all about sustainability, right? Trent Domingo, NY Theory, the late Cynthia Scales, I'm looking right at her, Gracie Mitchell. We have not worked decades not to see what we are doing. Anna Lilius, who's attended every conference, we've not worked decades so that when we pass away, the work passes away. This is about sustainability. This is about sustainability. And so in the spirit of Zora Neale Hurston, we need to have a little bit of money from a whole lot of people, all right? So I'm a product of 20th century technology, and so I have this written down on a card, even though it came to me on my text. As they say, right now, I don't mean to embarrass you, so you don't have to do it right now, but you can go to PEC 2023 text to 44321 and you can sign up. Okay? You can actually, it's not just enough though that you sign up, forget the phone. It's that you help to spread the word, because there are tens of thousands, I may say hundreds of thousands of people who love Zora Neale Hurston. They actually do. And Zora Neale Hurston and her hometown need your, no, Zora Neale Hurston doesn't need us, but we need Zora Neale Hurston, right? That genius does not need us. She is going to live on and on and on because of her work, but we need you, all right? So it's PEC. Does this work? 2223. Is anybody trying it? Text 44321. That's what we need from you, to spread the word and make a commitment. If you can do that, if you can do that. Now, if you have a mortgage and you're barely making it, all right? But if you do Starbucks or Wawa three times a week, you know, then think about us, as I say, once a month, because that is really what it is, once a month. And what does that mean? If we can get 1,000 people, I want to really quantify it for you. Our goal is that this time next year, we're going to be able to announce on her birthday, January 7, that we have 1,000 people who have committed for 1 year to give a certain amount of money. As they say on public radio, whatever fits your budget. Yeah, whatever fits your budget, okay? So that's my commercial. That's the real deal, because all of this is wonderful, but if we cannot sustain ourselves, then it's just been a wonderful exercise.